and a mini-tour is not a bad thing, is it, really? So here we are. Just a few announcements before we start. First of all, my name's David Raw, and this is my friend Simon Colbeck, and you'll be finding out a little bit more as time goes on. And just to introduce things, this event this afternoon really came out of nothing. Some while ago, I had to do an essay for Wolverhampton University, and I happened to choose the opposition to the First World War. And I came across some books by a lady called Jo Vellicott, who is a professor in Canada, and then wrote the essay. I won't tell you what the mark was, but it was okay. And it was marked by somebody who believed in the war, which was quite interesting. And one thing led to another, and Jo is now 96. And last year she came to the UK for a visit, and I was very surprised and pleased really to be invited to come and meet her along with other people, and that's where Simon and I got to know each other. And when we were talking, as you do, and we'd only had tea, we hadn't had anything else, it was said, why don't we have a blue plaque at Hawse End? Because this is a famous lady who has been hiding her light under a bushel. And so that's what we decided to do. And between us we've kind of improvised and nudged and pushed and tried to get things done. And I want to say a big thank you to the people at Hawse End, because they've been terrific. I mean, you see what they've done for today, but over the piece, for several months now, they've been very, very helpful. And so we hope this is going to be an afternoon of celebration. Now we've got one or two adjustments to make to what passed as a programme. This is the way, you know, you improvise and you make it up as you go along. But what we're going to do is we're going to follow the programme, except for two things. On the programme you'll see that Dr. Cyril Pearce was going to come and talk about the No Conscription Fellowship, of which Catherine was the National Secretary. Now Cyril set off from Huddersfield at 9 o'clock this morning, and he chose to travel by train, which it turns out wasn't a good choice. And there was no train, but they put a replacement bus service on, and I got a panicky message about 10:30, I'm on the bus. And then another one, I'm still on the bus. And then another one, I've nearly impressed them. And then another one, I've managed to get a train. They said it was going to stop in Penrith, but now they said it's not. It's going to go to Carlisle. And then I got another message saying, I've spoken to the guard and they are going to stop in Penrith. And so Cyril now will be getting in a taxi at Penrith railway station. So we hope that by the time we've finished everything, Cyril will turn up. But if he does, it'll be great, because he certainly does know his stuff about the No Conscription Fellowship. But we've got other things to do today, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you, and especially the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor of Keswick, who have come along, and very pleased that they've done that for us, so thank you for that. We're going to start, well, I'll just give you a quote. The first time Catherine came here, she sent a letter to somebody, and she said it was very wet and very windy, but we had a good time. so let's hope that, you know, this is Catherine type weather. I've also got a bit of a feeling for Catherine, because she came from a West Yorkshire family, and I was brought up in West Yorkshire, and Cyril's from Huddersfield as well. So it's a bit of a West Yorkshire takeover today, but never mind about that. So yes, it's wet and windy, and we're going to enjoy ourselves, and we're going to find it interesting as well. There will be cups of tea, coffee at the end, if you want to have some. The choir, I'm delighted to see them looking resplendent in their suffragist outfits with the green, white and red colours. They're going to be singing for us, and we shall have a solo as well. Now, the music will be at the end of the presentations rather than in between, otherwise we'll be moving backwards and forwards. So we're going to start now, and I'm very pleased to say that Gail Capstick has come along. We had hoped at one time that Joel Bertie, who's from Keswick, was going to make a presentation about Catherine and her work with the NUWSS. Unfortunately, she has had a hip operation and her leg got broken in the process, and she's now recuperating. It's going to be quite a long job. And Gail, very bravely and very kindly, said, "Oh, I'll come along and I'll stand in for her." So thank you, Gail, and if you'd like to do your presentation now, we shall look forward to it. Thank you.
On the programme it says that I'm from Manchester University. I'm not from Manchester University. I did the research for this for an independent project in Lancaster, which is called Documenting Dissent, and it looked at different aspects of dissent. It looked at conscription and the no conscription fellowship, and we also looked at the suffragist movement, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So it was a global link project that I did this for. So Catherine Marshall, I'll talk a little bit about her background, her work in Keswick, and then her wider work in London and also internationally. So if you go to the first slide, a lot of this information is also on the charts that people have produced at the back. So Catherine was born into a middle-class family. Initially, she lived in Harrow in London, and her father, Francis, also known as Frank, was a master at Harrow School. Her mother, Caroline, had been a teacher at a private school before marriage. And there was a younger brother, Hal, born in 1883. And over there on the pictures at the back, there is a family picture, so maybe you'll look at the pictures later. The wider Marshall family owned a lot of land in the Lake District. So the Marshalls of Leeds had been flax spinners since the 18th century. And John Marshall became a millionaire as a result of the company's success. Catherine's father had this house built here at Hawse End, at Derwentwater, and the family moved here to live permanently when he retired from teaching in Harrow. Catherine lived here as a young woman, and as with many women of her social class, she didn't have higher education and she didn't go into employment. So just to explain as well for the audience why we're looking at suffragism, just want to make a distinction between suffragists and suffragettes. Sometimes the movement for women's votes is associated with the Pankhursts, who were quite prominent. So Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, they were a breakaway movement, and they were not keen to do things by constitutional means. They wanted more shock tactics because they considered that the methods that had been done to try and obtain the vote since 1887 had not been very successful. So the campaign to secure the vote for women to have a voice in the running of the country had been going on for a number of years. And John Stuart Mill had submitted an amendment to the Second Reform Bill of 1887, but it was unsuccessful. By the end of the 19th century, there were several different types of campaign, one of which was a peaceful campaign of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And this is an image of the National Union of Women's Societies. So it wasn't the WSPU with which the Pankhursts are associated, it's a different society. And this image of a tree is showing the different branches. This image doesn't show Keswick, and it doesn't show anywhere really in Cumbria, so it's quite an early image. So Catherine, as I said, was involved in the NUW process, and that was looking at achieving votes for women by constitutional means, by negotiation. It wasn't to do with some of the more prominent tactics like chaining yourself to railings or throwing yourself under a horse. So Catherine's early involvement began in 1904 when she was still in London, and she was a member then of the London Society for Women's Suffrage. So that's the image, and as you see, it has branches and she was a member with her mother of the London branch. She wasn't particularly active then. The activity, when she became more of an activist, was when she lived here at Hawse End. So it is in this house, in 1908, that the Keswick Suffrage Society was formed, and it was a branch of this national union. Caroline Marshall, who was Catherine's mother, was the president, and Catherine became the Honourable Organising Secretary. And in her words, as she wrote it, a committee was formed, rules drawn up, and active propaganda work started at once. It was unanimously decided that our object should be votes for women on the same terms as for men, and that the association should be a strictly non-party organisation. We also pledged ourselves to peaceful and constitutional methods only. Catherine initially began work only in Cumberland and Westmoreland, and while she was in the Keswick area, this involved writing letters, organising meetings, and she set up a stall in Keswick. Nowadays, I think most of us are familiar with events and there's a stall, and you can see a stall out there. But according to Elizabeth Crawford, one of the authors of a book on the suffragist movement, Catherine Marshall's initiative of setting up a stall in Keswick Marketplace from which to sell suffrage literature was one that was soon emulated by other NUWSS societies. She was full of energy in campaigning across Westmoreland and Cumberland, organising there a model campaign for the general election in January 1910. Caroline did public speaking. She had done public speaking at a school in Scotland, and she practised and honed some of her skills there. She also organised a caravan which toured around the area, and this inspired women in Kendal and led them to setting up a branch in Westmoreland. The first annual report of the Keswick Society for the year 1908 to 1909 documents the activities. In 1910, the Keswick branch of the NUWSS was involved in a lot of outreach work. There were meetings held in Keswick, Threlkeld, Cockermouth, Workington, Arlecton, Frizington, Egremont and Cleator-Moor. And in June 1907, the North West Suffrage Societies had formed a federation, and their first AGM was held in Carlisle in 1911, and Catherine attended that event. Whilst at Keswick, Catherine organised a march to campaign for women's suffrage under the auspices of Keswick Urban District Council. And there is a fantastic banner from this march that still exists, housed in the Carlisle Archive Centre. And when I went recently, or a couple of years ago, to the Archive Centre, they didn't know they'd got that there, and they had to kind of got it out for us. It's huge. So the image of this banner belongs to Keswick Town Council, and the project that I'm on, or I was on in Lancaster, the project coordinator had to ask for permission for the banner to be shown in the article. And this is an thing that was featured in the Cumberland and Westmoreland Gazette. Cumberland Westmoreland Herald, so they had to agree to be permission to use the image. So there again, a smaller version of the banner. So Catherine's activities were not limited to Keswick, and whilst her early activism was only in the Lake District, she began to have more of a national profile. She was willing and able to travel within Cumberland and beyond. In July 2010, she was a member of the delegation from Keswick that attended a demonstration in Trafalgar Square. So there's an image there of the demonstration that shows a lot of the societies from Cumberland and Westmoreland. And although you can't see it unless it's blown up, you might need a magnifying glass. In the middle there is one male dissenter who has a banner protesting against the idea of votes for women. There were a number of protesters at the time, both male and female, so somehow he got himself into the picture, protesting at votes for women.
He did consider
It's a good idea. She attended a women's suffrage congress at Stockholm in 1911, which she refers to as being particularly difficult when writing to Lady Courtney of Penwith on 21st of September 1915. Unfortunately, she doesn't elaborate on this, and we don't know why it was difficult. We can skip the next slide. National and international work. So in 1911, Catherine joined the core group in the NUWSS. So she's moving outwards from Cumbria and becoming more involved in more national and international work. And she worked with the then honorary secretary. She led the press department, and in 1911, she went to Stockholm. She represented a group at the meeting there. She then became parliamentary secretary for the NUWSS due to the illness of Edith Palliser. This involved motivating local groups to lobby MPs, while she applied pressure to key figures. At that time, Catherine Marshall and several of the Marshalls were Liberals, and Catherine worked with senior Liberal MPs who in theory supported women's suffrage, but in practice actually did very little. It was she who initiated the women's suffrage pilgrimage to London, which led to a deputation to the then Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, in 1913. In this march, women travelled throughout the country, marching on 8 different routes, acquiring people as they went. In February 1915, there was a Women's International Congress in The Hague, and she helped to organise this. Unfortunately, the shipping lanes were closed, and none of the women from Britain were able to actually attend this congress. Resignation from the NUWSS. As I mentioned with the Pankhursts, there were factions within the movement for women's suffrage, and the NUWSS was no different. In 1915, the First World War divided the society. Catherine Marshall and others wished to work for peace, and were disappointed with the view of some of the NUWSS. While some wished to continue to support the war effort, those who resigned were in opposition to the war and thought the NUWSS should work for peace. Catherine Marshall was among 11 prominent women in the NUWSS to resign, sending her letter of resignation to Mrs. Millicent Fawcett, who was the president of the union, on the 3rd of March 1915. And an excerpt from her letter of resignation, she says, "I have come to the conclusion that I cannot remain an officer of the National Union. I feel that the most urgent duty for women, and especially for suffragist women, in this appalling calamity of war that has come upon us, is to do their utmost to minimise the disastrous results of war and to help prepare for a right use of victory if it comes." So Catherine was one of 11 key members that resigned because they didn't consider the focus of the NUWSS was going in the way they wished to support. So from 1915 onwards, Catherine moved towards more pacifist and socialist activities, and she linked these to her feminist beliefs and values. A letter dated the 3rd of February 1915 from Catherine Marshall to Mrs. Oliver Strachey states, "I do not consider it within our province to conduct a campaign on any questions totally disconnected from the suffrage question, but I consider that questions of peace and war are intimately connected with women's suffrage." Catherine resigned from the NUWSS to focus on peace activism, to work with the Non-Conscription Fellowship, and later with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. In her work for women's suffrage, for conscientious objectors, and for peace activism, Catherine played a key role, although periods of ill health at times affected the contributions that she could make. From 1916-17 onwards, she continually had bouts of ill health. Catherine saw the women's movement as part of a social programme, a nexus of dissent at the time. When she resigned from the NUWSS, she did not therefore give up the suffrage cause. Catherine was invited back to Keswick to speak about what possession of the parliamentary vote means in 1918, and she continued to make close links with the suffrage cause. Catherine was one of a number of activists. Her work involved going out, speaking, and enlisting support at different times like a missionary. It is not known to what extent she shaped the organisation in the North West, but her work was significant and influential. And she rose to national and international prominence. She worked tirelessly to establish organisation and create structures, sometimes to the detriment of her health. She was a leader, an initiator, and a team player. According to her biographer, Jo Vellicott, and some of the books are for sale out there, Catherine believed in personal contact and had no reservations about setting up formal and informal meetings with anyone with whom she wanted to talk. She had agency, she had courage and was visionary. She challenged belief systems, knew what strings to pull and how to do it. In 2018, Catherine has achieved some more national and local recognition. Catherine Marshall received posthumous recognition of her suffrage work this year, and she's one of the names of men and women unveiled on the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square this year. The statue of Millicent Fawcett was unveiled, and Catherine's name is among the people who was mentioned on that statue. In the same year, locally, so she's had the national recognition, and in the same year she's also receiving posthumous recognition of her suffrage work and her peace activism work, with the plaque that's going to be unveiled here at Hawse End, hung for a number of years, where she lived as a young adult with her parents, and to which she later returned after living for some time in London.
Thank you very much, Gail. That was terrific. It's now my privilege to introduce somebody I call a friend, who in fact is a relative of Catherine's, and he's very bravely said he's standing for Cyril to talk about no conscription fellowship. If Cyril suddenly emerges down the chimney, sit down. So you're a good lad. Come on you go.
This isn't my notes. I haven't got any notes because I wasn't expecting to be doing this bit. And if, as David said, if Cyril comes in, I shall immediately hand over to him. And Gail's kindly said that if I dry out at any point, she might be able to fill in as well.
Yeah. Excuse me while I look for bits on my laptop.
So Gail's already mentioned the rift within the NWSS, which led Catherine to divert her attentions from campaigning for suffrage and women's issues towards putting all her efforts into the war resistance and conscientious objection movement. What actually brought this rift to a head was the plan for the Hague Women's Peace Conference in 1915, to which women from all the combatant countries and many neutral countries were planning to assemble together and to try and put pressure on the governments and to get a delegation from neutral countries, which actually happened. They managed to get a delegation from neutral countries to go around meeting, offering to mediate and find a way to negotiate an end to the war. Catherine was involved in the planning group for this conference, and she very much wanted, along with the others who eventually ended up resigning, she wanted the NUWSS to give its official backing to this conference and to the British delegation going to the conference. But Millicent Fawcett was the main obstacle. She believed very strongly in the war effort, and that Britain, I'm not saying that she necessarily supported Britain going to war, but being at war, she believed that it was women's duty, very much like Emily and Crystal Hampton believed. She believed it was women's duty to give their backing to our boys, and she used the phrase, which upset many of those who disagreed with her within the NUSS, that to talk of peace is akin to treason. So she felt that even to talk about negotiating for peace was a treasonous thing to do, and that severely upset. I mean, once she'd made a statement like that publicly, although she was making it in a personal capacity and not as the president of the NUSS, everyone knew her as the president of the NUSS. So once she'd said that, there was really no way back in terms of the conflict, the rift between the peace mix, if you like, within the NUSS, like Catherine Marshall, and the militarists. I'm kind of over-caricaturing them, but so that was what led really more or less directly to the resignation of all those members of the executive. And tactically, it may not have been a particularly good move, because it left the whole organisational structure in the hands of the people the women who supported the war effort. And some people pleaded with Catherine and with Helena Swanwick and some of the other prominent peace women, if you like, within the NUR, to reconsider and to remain involved, even though to swallow their disagreements for the time being was hard. But what Catherine eventually chose to do was, although she was involved, she couldn't get to the peace conference, as we heard, because the Navy somewhat suspiciously introduced a blockade at a convenient moment, which meant that none of the British delegates were able to go to this Women's Peace Conference. But what she was involved in the founding of the British branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which still exists today, and we're honoured, Catherine, along with some of the other leading women founders of WILF, by producing these pull-up banners a couple of years ago, and I borrowed this one of Catherine from WILF to bring up today. So she can stand alongside me. She was slightly taller than that, in fact. She's a very tall woman, I think nearly 6 foot. As you could, I don't know if you've got a picture of her in that London, a larger picture of her in that London demonstration, but you can see she's standing in a white coat in the middle, and she's sort of towering above everybody else, including the male interloper. So Catherine, she was involved in the setting up of WILF. She was torn between whether she could continue, although she'd resigned from the executive, whether she could continue in working specifically for women's issues, or whether she would be more effective in lending her skills and her experience and her contacts to the No Conscription Fellowship, which was this organisation that had been set up right at the beginning of the war by 2 young socialists, Clifford Allen and Fenner Brockway. Catherine Marshall decided that she wanted to give her support to the No Conscription Fellowship, and she was invaluable to them right from the start for several reasons. Firstly, because through her suffrage work she knew a lot of the leading politicians. She knew Asquith, the Prime Minister. She knew, politicians, members of Parliament in all the main political parties. So that range of contacts, even though obviously most of the leaders of political parties, including within the Labour Party, were generally in support of the war, that meant she had some kudos, she had some weight with them. And she knew how to get messages to them and knew how to get their ear. Secondly, she played an enormous part in the organisation. The NUSS had restructured in the late 1900s into a much more democratic and integrated structure, where there were sort of ways of the branches could contribute to decision making at the centre, at the top, if you like. Much more democratic, in fact, incidentally, than the WSPU, which was basically a dictatorship under Emmeline Pankhurst. And if you're a lover of Emmeline Pankhurst and you want to argue with me afterwards, please do. The contacts that Catherine had were invaluable. The organisational skills and experience that she had were invaluable, and perhaps no less important was the fact that she had access to a man named Bertrand Russell, some of you may have heard of. He became perhaps more famous later, but even then he was quite a famous sort of mathematician and philosopher celebrity, the nearest thing you could have to a celebrity in those days before social media and TV and all the rest of it. seriously you'd have to an academic celebrity anyway. And he, because she'd grown up in Harrow as part of the school environment there, and she knew lots of boys who went on to Cambridge, of course. She would have known Winston Churchill incidentally, but that's another story. She knew a chap called Walter Pigou, who was a student of, was an economist and a student of.
I think someone to lend me a fiver for the taxi.
I've been impersonating you for the last 10 minutes. How are you feeling?
I'm all right, a bit frazzled actually.
You want a cup of tea?
I need a cup of tea.
All right. Do you want to carry on a bit and then have a slot?
You carry on, but can somebody lend me some money for the taxi man?
Oh,
You got the money there? He doesn't have any
Drive round it.
Like a wig round.
I'll be back in a minute.
So, as with war resistance and suffrage campaigning, improvisation is going to when the taxi's been paid. So how can I fill in there? We'll give Cyril a chance to draw breath. Where was it? She got Bertrand Russell on board.
If you want an interlude, I was at the Bradford Peace Museum yesterday, and I discovered that Catherine Marshall was secretary, of course, of the NCF. She became chairman when Clifford Allen spent time in prison.
Yeah.
So she was chairman in, well before there was women's votes. So it was marvellous.
Of the NCF. Yeah.
Oh yes, of her, yeah.
1960.
But yes, but Bertrand
Twice, I
Russell
think.
was a real
Yeah.
catch, and she persuaded him by nagging him. She went for walks with him. She wrote letters to him. She, for all I knew, she phoned him up. About telephones, and she got him on board. And he, in his own, we know this because from his own letters to Lady Ottilie Morell, who was his mistress at the time. He talks about Catherine Marshall's been badgering me, and I've agreed to join the NCF and to help them with their campaigns and propaganda. And this was all around the time that the Military Service Act actually became law, so it was actually the key point really for the movement. They'd lost their campaign to try and prevent the Military Service Act being enacted, to stop conscription. Having lost that campaign, all their attention was obviously going to go towards how do we support the people who are going to resist, who are going to refuse to enlist in the war effort. And the tribunal system had been set up, so that the National No Conscription Fellowship, the NCF, was putting together this organisation of support, advice, how to advise conscripts appearing before, or people, potential conscripts who are pleading conscience objection, appearing before tribunals. And that might be a good point. How are you feeling, Cyril? Do you want to?
Yeah, I need to sort my projector out.
Okay, you've got some
I've
slides.
got some pictures to show
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know what I could do while you're doing that. I could read. We've had a lovely
Have you got the thing from Joe?
message from Joe Vellicott. So this is a slight interruption. Again, we were going to do this at the end, but if you need a few minutes to kind of sort out your slides, Adrian might want to help you.
Oh, good. Good. Excellent.
I will read
You've got a laptop there.
an email
splendid.
which I received from Joe Vellicott, to whom many of us owe just about everything we know about Catherine Marshall, because she's done a huge amount of research on papers that were actually very fortuitously discovered to have been left here at Hawse End a few years after Catherine's death in 1961. Joe Vellicott was the first person to properly sort those papers in the Carlisle Records Office. She was actually looking for
Have you got
doing
a
research
spare
on
USB
Russell
for me,
at the time.
Zappa?
But she found amongst these papers, I'll give it to you in her own words, because she's written, she's in very poor health, she's 96 years old, but she would have so much love to be here. But she's written a message for us today for this occasion, which I'll read out to you today. It's a joy to be with you in spirit as you gather to unveil the plaque to Catherine Marshall of Hawse End. As far as I know, I never met Catherine, but she's played a very large role in my life. By the time Catherine died, she was almost unremembered as a public figure. There was no interest in her papers, and she left them piled in hampers in a shed here at Hawse End. Later, they were rescued by the good sense of the warden of the Education Centre and of the newly appointed Cumberland County archivist, Bruce Jones. Bruce told me that he took the papers away because they had some interest as an archive of a Cumberland family of note. But that what had also intrigued him and settled the deal was letters he saw sticking out here and there that carried signatures of noteworthy politicians of recent history. Not for Catherine herself, who knew or wanted to know anything about her. For that matter, Catherine was only of secondary interest to me too. I knew only of her connection with Bertrand Russell and the No Conscription Fellowship. I had come to England with a secret hope of finding a hidden archive of the NCF. None had, nor has been found. Be careful what you wish for. Here I was, faced with 40 boxes of unsorted material containing a disorganised archive of the NCF, another of the non-militant suffrage movement, also of little interest at the time, and much more. Sorting the papers, there was no one else to do it, took up years of my research life and much of the grant money I've been blessed with. But I've been well rewarded by the excitement of discovery, of finding material that flew in the face of accepted wisdom, of getting to know Catherine and some of her closest friends better than I could have hoped for. One of my best research times was when I spent the summer months in 1969 in Carlisle with my young daughter and her partner, all living on a single Canada Council research grant and having a good time while working hard together. My thesis in my first book became a detailed account of the No Conscription Fellowship in the First World War and of Bertrand Russell's leadership in it. Later, as I followed Catherine's activities for women, for peace and women's rights, I spent time in a number of collections in London and Manchester, in Colorado, South Carolina, France, Amsterdam and Pennsylvania. I've also had generous help from many owners of public collections and from the Marshall family itself. So thank you, Catherine, for giving me opportunities that I could never have had without you. One of the biggest joys of my life has been the discovery that my books are actually read by historians in Britain and respected by some. Many of those present today among them. It's a joy too to get to know. Oh, I don't know if I've forgotten this bit. It's a joy too to get to know Simon Colbeck, an ardent follower of Catherine, a descendant of her mother's side of the family. And more recently, the happenstance that led to meeting with Caroline Wilson, who has her own story to tell of Catherine. It's a great pleasure and relief to be working with Lindsay Jenkins, to whom I'm sending my research papers to continue my work on Catherine with my blessing. As you may know, the volume 1 of Catherine Marshall's biography only takes us up to 1914, the beginning of the First World War, whereas volume 2, which Lindsay Jenkins will be completing from Catherine, Joe Vellicott's notes and drafts, will take the story on into her work in the First World War and beyond. Back to Joe. Most of what I've written here is about my personal experience of getting to know Catherine. The real message of her life and the importance of her work is to reveal the role of peaceful means in making change for the better. Honour those who converted members of Parliament one by one to support the women's franchise. Honour those who opposed the First World War, that meaningless bloodbath. Honour those who tried and failed to embody clauses in the Treaty of Versailles that might have made the Second World War less inevitable. Always look for a peaceful route and question those who tell you it won't work. How well do you think methods of violence have worked? Joe Vellicott, October the 12th, 2018. Cyril, feeling there?
Thank you, Sam. I don't know how much you've
You
said
need
about
another intro?
so.
What were you going to say?
Well, what I'm going to say, well, he's a good lad.
We share the burden of being Huddersfield Town supporters.
It's a shame, isn't it, really? Catherine knows about that.
Well, you've had quite a journey. Bus, train, canal?
Not quite, no. It just felt like it
It
at
feels
times.
like it outside, doesn't it? Now, Cyril, used to be, I think, have you retired now? You're still
I've
active?
been retired for years.
I thought you had. Was at Leeds University, and his big magnum opus has been to research the conscientious objectors in the First World War, and part of that, I think, was locally influenced because one of the few towns in England not to raise a Pals battalion was Huddersfield. Largely because of the climate of opinion and people's views at that time. And what Cyril's done is an amazing piece of work. I believe the number's between 17 and 18,000?
As of last night,
But still coming in,
as of last night on the database, we have 19,740.
conscientious objectors. And he studied who they were, what they did, what happened to them. One of my favourite stories, I hope it's accurate, I'll be told if it's not, was of Catherine hearing that the Richmond Castle prisoners, who were conscientious objectors, Richmond near Scotch Corner, were put on a train and they were being sent to France, because if they arrived in France, they'd then be regarded as being in a combat area, and if they refused to do as they were told, they could be shot at door. And Catherine heard about this, and she went banging on the door of number 10 to see another West Yorkshire gentleman originally, Herbert Asquith, from Morley, the Prime Minister, and she told him what was going on, and Asquith, to his credit, I believe, said one word, abominable, and he sent a message to Hague to say these men must be returned to the United Kingdom. Well, Cyril's big work is on the conscientious objectors. He's going to tell us about that, and also the connections with Catherine. So, well done for getting here, Cyril.
Well done. Dave set me up to give you a plug or two before I actually launch into what I want to say about Catherine and her work with the Mill Conscription Fellowship. That is that if you don't have to be a regular watcher of Emmerdale, but if you happen to tune into ITV at 8:30 on Thursday night this next week, the 18th, there's one of their series called Emmerdale 1918. And in that particular part of that series, I'm there talking about a CEO from York called Alf Martlew. I'm not allowed to tell you what his story is, so you'd best tune in and see. The other thing too is interesting that Dave mentioned the importance of Huddersfield, not just to me, and to him as well, as town fans, but also to students of the anti-war movement in Britain in the First World War. It is because Huddersfield was something of a centre for opposition to the war. The absence of a Pals battalion is only one symptom of that. But within the people from the anti-war movement in Huddersfield, there are a number of quite interesting characters. And here's another telly plug. Sometime over the next couple of weeks in the run-up to Armistice Day, and I don't know why it's ITV doing all this, and not the BBC, goodness knows. The BBC's been very disappointing on the matter of covering conscientious objects in the First World War as part of the commemoration process. But ITV are going to be shooting some film about one of the Huddersfield CEOs, a man called Arthur Gardner. So look out for that. I have no idea when it's going to be broadcast. I do know they want me to show them round Huddersfield a week on Monday. But back to Catherine. By the way, there's some copies of my book, Comrades in Conscience, on the table. I was told to bring them.
For the price of a taxi.
Just about to cover the taxi, yes. Perhaps stop. Go with the first picture, please. I really would like to take a part of what Simon was saying earlier on in terms of acknowledging the work that Joe Bellicott's done. Catherine Marshall, I think until Joe got busy on that wonderful archive that she helped to preserve and initially list together with colleagues from the Cumbria County Record Service. I think before Joe began that process, the women's movement's history, not too surprisingly really, centred on the Pankhursts, Emmeline Fawcett of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society, and so on. It was the headline items, and what it didn't concentrate on at all, quite frankly, and there's still a great gap in women's history on this account. What it didn't cover, and except for Jo's work, hasn't yet covered, is the work of people like Catherine, in fact the work of Catherine, the people who organised the day-to-day activity of the women's suffrage movement, whether it was suffragette or the more peaceful suffragists. And Catherine, I think, was central to all of that. When she was at the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society, I think it's true to say that she more or less invented the textbook for public relations. And she applied what she'd learnt in her activity as a quiet, behind-the-scenes lobbyist to the work she did for the No Conscription Fellowship, and I'll come to that in a minute or two. The other thing I think that Jo's work has done quite remarkably, and from my point of view, not before time, frankly, is to unpack the nature of the response of the women's movement to the First World War. There is a notion within the history of the women's movement at the time of the First World War that, yes, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, we don't talk about Sylvia because she took a different view, but the Pankhursts took the view that the women had better throw in their lot with the First World War, the better to ensure that after the war was over, they got the vote. Emmeline Fawcett at the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society seemed to have taken the same view. Militant Fawcett at the NUWSS. Whether that was the case or not, it seemed to dictate the nature of the women's movement's response, or at least some parts of the women's movement's response. Jo's work has explored the fact that within the women's movement there were huge differences of opinion. And she was one of those very active in NUWSS who left on account of the NUWSS's stance on the war. That also happened within the suffragette movement, the National Union of the Women's Social and Political Union, with the Pankhursts, and Sylvia, of course, was one of the key figures in that. That is now being thoroughly explored, and Jo's books have made a major contribution to that process. Next, please. We do know that Catherine left the NUWSS in the spring of 1915, threw in her lot with the Women's International League. Later it became the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and there's no two ways about understanding what they were up to. They were after a negotiated end to the war. She then, during the course of 1915, as it became increasingly apparent that conscription would be resorted to by central government, she then moved in the direction of the new conscription fellowship. And here she is, and there's a kind of gendered image here. Here's the membership of the No Conscription Fellowship Executive Committee, the great and the good. Here's Bertrand Russell, Fenner Brockway, Clifford Allen, of course, and sitting dutifully at the end as if she'd just made the tea and was writing some notes is Catherine. Her role was far from just making the tea and writing a few notes, I have to say. Next one, please. In the summer of 1916, these, if you like, the public image of the No Conscription Fellowship in 1916, these men, in fact the whole of the committee, with the exception of Catherine, were charged with the, contrary to the Defence of the Realm Act, with the publication of a pamphlet which urged that the legislation introducing conscription should be withdrawn, rescinded, cancelled if you like. Conscription shouldn't have happened, it should come to an end. And here they all are, the six members of the committee who decided that they'd face the charge in court, and all of them refused to accept payment of the fine and serve time in prison. They are the great and the good, if you like, of the public face of the No Conscription Fellowship. Walter Ailes, later Member of Parliament for Bristol, a fascinating man I've only discovered in the last year or so, John Fletcher from York, who before the war was a very interesting agent for the Society of Friends in Australia and New Zealand, campaigning there with local people against the introduction of conscription. He came back to Britain, promptly joined the No Conscription Fellowship, and within a very short time was in prison. Other prisoners, of course, Arthur Barrett Brown, this is Will Chamberlain, who was editor of the Tribunal for quite some time. Arthur Barrett Brown, who didn't always see eye to eye with Charlotte on many things. In fact, he regarded her as a bit of a collaborationist when it came to government. But nevertheless, he's there. Of course, we have Clifford Allen, looking his pale, wan and romantic self, which rather seemed to have captivated Catherine, according to all accounts. And Fenner Brockway, a much more robust character, who you probably have met over time, people of a certain age. This is the public face of the No Conscription Fellowship. Next, please. Here's Catherine. I love the juxtaposition of these two photographs, because that initial photograph of the men who were charged and served time is outside the law courts, and here's Catherine, who's been outside the law courts with them, making her escape. And it seems to me symptomatic and typical of her relationship with the No Conscription Fellowship. She wasn't one of the people who were up front, which is one of the reasons why she's been ignored for so long. She was the major figure in the backroom activity of the No Conscription Fellowship. During her time there, she established the whole paraphernalia of organising the branches, nearly 200 branches across the country. She gave them instructions as to what the No Conscription Fellowship Executive Committee might wish them to do, the routines that they were to be involved with, watching tribunal proceedings, reporting in detail what happened to individual conscientious objectors, sending those reports to the centre, so that those at the centre, about 20 of them eventually by 1917, all full-time with some volunteers, so that those at the centre could make records of the stories of different conscientious objectors, both for the sake of the No Conscription Fellowship, but also for the sake of the conscientious objector families. Once COs went into the prison and court-martial system, quite often they were lost to sight for some time. Families worried about where they'd got to. One of the jobs that Fenner Brockway said he thoroughly appreciated Catherine and her team doing was to reassure families as to where individual COs had fetched up. Next one, please. That team of gatherers and informers and lobbyists was also behind the No Conscription Fellowship's regular weekly journal, The Tribunal, edited initially by Will Chamberlain. Here's the issue of the 18th of May 1916, which reports the arrest of the Executive Committee. That's there because it's important, as a reflection of that. But the important thing about the Tribunal was that it was circulated across the country, not always easily. From time to time, the government or local authorities, under the powers vested in them by the Defence of the Realm Act, took a guinea, wanted to shut it down, confiscate it, even raided print shops where it was being printed. But for some reason, Catherine always seemed to be one step ahead. Very few print works were actually raided in the process of producing the Tribunal. So it was a remarkable survivor throughout the war. The next one, please, is another thing. Not only was the team at the centre producing material which helped to inform the Tribunal, but they were also producing this, a simply cyclostyled, the early forms of photocopying, if you remember, that purple ink on white paper, heads nodding around the room, you experienced this kind of thing. During the war, and from the beginning of 1916 right to the very end, No Conscription Fellowship, in collaboration with the Society of Friends, became something that they call the Conscientious Objector Information Bureau. And they produced this. It's a bi-weekly summary, if you like, of the latest events in the anti-war movement. You'll find in it details of individual COs, when they are court-martialed, when they are sent to prison, when they've appeared before a tribunal, what the results have been, and so on. And it wasn't just for internal circulation within the No Conscription Fellowship and the anti-war community, it certainly was that. But, more importantly, and this is why I refer back to what I said earlier on about Catherine and her role as, if you like, the maker of the playbook for the public relations activity of the No Conscription Fellowship because she had a list of more than 200 names of the great and the good, including practically every bishop and archbishop in the country, even Bramwell Booth, head of the Salvation Army, politicians, journalists, literary figures, John Masefield, George Bernard Shaw, John Galsworthy, you name it, they were there. The reason why they got a copy was that Catherine identified the reality of what you might call soft power, soft influence, long before that phrase was ever talked about. These were opinion formers. She was in the business of providing them with the raw material on which they might form opinions sympathetic to COs, sympathetic to the anti-war cause and so on. The extent to which that was successful is debatable. Nevertheless, it was an attempt that she was very good at. Next one, please. Another thing that Catherine and her team did was to provide material